It's been a while since we have done one of these, so welcome to the Network Book Forum event that we usually organize around books. And today we are going to discuss Code Dependent, Living in the Shadow of AI and Data. My name is Ranjit Singh. I'm a senior researcher with the AI on the Ground team here at Data and Society, and I'll be the moderator of today's discussion. This event is supported by our assistant producer, Tunika Oneki-Kami, and our network engagement associate, Ireti Akirinade. For those who are joining us for the first time, Data and Society is an independent research institute studying the social implications of data and automation. We produce original research and convene regular multidisciplinary thinkers to challenge the power and purpose of technology in society. So our guests today, and one of them is still kind of in the process of making it, are Madhumita Murgia, who's going to be joining us very soon, and Armin Samii, who's here. Madhumita is the author of the book Code Dependent, Living in the Shadow of AI. Her groundbreaking book is the subject of today's discussion, and I hope that she's going to be joining us fairly soon. She's an award-winning Indian-British journalist and commentator who writes about the impact of technology and science on society, and she's currently the AI editor at the Financial Times in London, where she leads global coverage of AI and other emerging technologies. Armin Samii is an activist and technologist focusing on bicycling safety and electoral reform. In 2020, he launched UberCheats to help gig workers advocate for fair pay. In Code Dependent, Armin's story is the focus of a chapter on how data-driven systems come to play the role of the boss in algorithmic management of work. He has also founded dashcam.bike to help bicycle commuters advocate for safer streets. He chairs Better Streets Lawrenceville and serves on the board of directors for Bike Pittsburgh. We'll be spending the next hour together. So I'm going to basically introduce you to what this book is about and frame the initial set of ways in which we can think about some of these issues. Data is everywhere. It surrounds us. It can be used to describe us, evaluate us, remind us of our lives gone by, and predict our possible futures. We have learned to live with it. Sometimes it can make life easier, and while at other times, it can make life unbearable. So how do we begin to weave the stories of these experiences of living with data together? Madhumita's work on Code Dependent spans stories from across the globe and calls attention to the voices of ordinary people who navigate the everyday challenges of living with algorithmic systems. In navigating their stories, Madhumita calls attention to how they work to reclaim their agency in the face of the impact that these systems have on them and their communities. Code Dependent invites a deeper reflection on the emergent nature of ordinary struggles of aligning with the inputs and outputs of data-driven systems. For most of the people of the world, or the majority world as we like to call it, the core challenge of living with data-driven systems is twofold. First, they have to navigate the various opacities in the workings of these systems to develop familiarity with it. And second, they have to figure out ways to reclaim their agency in navigating the ordinary challenges of making these systems work for them. To overcome these challenges, they must critically engage with both the making and management of agency that we are increasingly delegating to data-driven systems in making decisions about almost every aspect of everyday life, from curated social media content and chatbot-based customer service to automated government and financial services. And now in these contexts, the mundane moments of seeking alignment with inputs can be extractive and motivate claims to sovereignty and justice. Experiences of contending with uneven outputs often instigate solidarity and are implicated in calls for centering human dignity in interactions with data-driven systems broadly and AI more specifically. By showing the emergence and increasing prevalence of such systems across the world, the book highlights that data-driven systems do not act alone. Data-driven and human judgment are inevitably enmeshed in the process of charting the ethical landscape of everyday life with data and AI. After all, ethics cannot be separated from our everyday lives. So I've spoken a lot already. So what I'm going to do is to basically bring in Armin into this conversation and invite him to basically tell us a little bit more about your journey into this particular world of thinking about data and systems and how you've interfaced with them over the span of your engagement with Uber and now Dashcam.
Sounds good. And okay, Madhu is here. So I was just sending you the link. Yeah, well, great to be here. Nice to be here with everyone.
Sorry.
You're
Oh
good.
my God, what a nightmare.
Stuck on the tube?
Yeah, there was an accident, so they just kind of stopped and wouldn't move for like half an hour.
Oh,
So, yeah, sorry about this.
well, good.
No worries at
So
all. Armin,
yeah,
we'll start with you.
great. So the story that's included in the UberCheats. And how this came about was I was working at a company and decided to leave my job in the early days of the pandemic, and decided to spend the beautiful days of that summer biking around. And instead of just biking, I was curious, like, what if I don't have a job, why don't I deliver for Uber Eats? So I decided to bike and get paid for doing my hobby, which was biking. And in that process, I realized that there's a lot of frustrations that Uber delivery drivers deal with that I may have had an inkling of, but I wasn't really confident in just how pervasive these issues were. And so one of these stories is there was a McDonald's. I live in Pittsburgh. There was a McDonald's in Pittsburgh where it either didn't exist or the address was wrong or something. Um, but I would get sent to an address that was a parking lot, and there was no McDonald's there, and say, pick up this $3 order. And I was like, well, there's no McDonald's here. And so what do I do? You can cancel the order, which costs you in the algorithm, right? The algorithm will penalize you if you cancel. So I said, well, instead of doing that, why don't I call the support line and let them know? And gee, wouldn't I be, the most helpful Uber delivery driver? I was on a bike, so not a Uber delivery biker. Um, and so I decided to call. I waited 40 minutes on hold, let them know. And they said, well, we don't have access to remove this McDonald's. You have to get in touch with McDonald's and tell them to call us to remove this store. Now, I mean that's not something that I'm going to go about doing, right? So they said, well, what we can give you is $2.50, and then we'll cancel the order for you. And so I got $2.50 for waiting on hold for 40 minutes, and the McDonald's was still there. Now, I learned in the same way that I think all Uber delivery people in Pittsburgh learned that if you get an order from this McDonald's, don't accept it. It doesn't exist. That's what I thought, and that's the story written in the book. I found out later that the McDonald's actually did exist. It just moved a block away. And so the address I was going to, the empty parking lot, was where the McDonald's used to be. They didn't update the address. And so either everybody else was canceling the order or they knew the secret location of the McDonald's. But regardless, the algorithm was just built for this efficiency that hurt the drivers, even hurt the customers. And we're kind of stuck between it, and we have no power to fight it, whether it's because the customer service agents don't have the power to make these changes. The systems are just not designed for people. They're designed for efficiency.
That is fun and harrowing story, but at the same time, it kind of brings us to the core set of things that Madhumita talks in detail in her book. So, Madhumita, how did you get into this process of thinking about writing this book in the first place? And then, when does, your process of writing the book kind of intersect with the story that Armin just told us?
Yeah, hi everyone. Sorry for my very dramatic and delayed entry, but I'm here and I'm very, very happy to be here with all of you. Thank you for joining me. So I've been writing about AI for 12 years now. I started back in 2012 when I was at Wired magazine, and for me, the I've always been fascinated by it because I used to be a biologist, and it felt like this really interesting amalgamation of of my fascination with the brain and sort of humans and how we work, and then technology and how the two collide. And so I've always kind of reported stories at the intersection of that. What happens when humans and technologies collide, and how do they change each other, and how are they, this is why my book is called Code Dependent, because for me it really encapsulated how the two shape each other in turn. And so when it came to the book, which I wrote the proposal for this book in 2021, so it was really before this new wave of crazy generative AI chatbot stuff. The idea was to write a book about humans living in a world increasingly inhabited by AI systems. So it wasn't, the idea was never for me to it wasn't an explanatory tech book saying, I've written about this technology and I'm going to explain how it works. It wasn't even about the people building the technology, the creators, who we often in the media and in our writing about AI in particular, we sort of put them on a pedestal, right? The mavericks and the makers. We've seen here, like the sort of extreme example of that is Elon Musk. What happens when a technologist is deified into being some sort of demigod and we expect him to solve all sorts of problems. I wanted to stay away from those narratives. They are interesting and important to explore, but for me it was how can I tell the stories of ordinary people whose lives have been changed by AI, and I wanted it the key for that, well, I wanted it to be a global book. So I wanted to step away from just the microcosm of Silicon Valley and to look at where this technology has reached, where has it sort of its fingers ended up, and how is that different in, say, Latin America or India versus Pittsburgh or Beijing or London, and to find both the similarities and the tensions there between different cultures interfacing and interacting with this technology. So yeah, it's really a book about people adapting, fighting, and in some cases sort of being victimized through AI technologies and trying to understand a bit better how to grapple with this through their stories. And Armin was an amazing sort of bright spot of an example of somebody who the opacity and the like crippling, lack of agency that you get with AI systems, but found a way through it, which I thought was a great example of how we should all approach this.
This is great because, it kind of brings up this interesting question that you've both landed on in terms of, just thinking about what does it mean to look under the hood of some of these systems and how do we actually go about doing that? And one of the ways in which some of this is, basically organized is that, somebody has to take charge in terms of thinking about, okay, I need to really figure out what's really going on. And it seems like, Armin, your story of UberCheats kind of does that in a very deeply meaningful and, it's kind of at the intersection of activism and advocacy, but I'm, wondering how you are thinking about how you put together the first your work on UberCheats in the first place. And then where do you see that work kind of taking you across the different ways in which you have thought about some of these issues? And you've continued that work after UberCheats as well. So I'm just curious about the journey that you've taken here.
Yeah, I'll dive into a story of how I got to UberCheats, and I'll note that I'm very self-conscious about doing this because Madhu wrote about me and put in the thing that whenever I'm trying to make a point, I always dive into a random story and then tie it back in. So
Sorry
um,
to make you self-aware by psychoanalyzing you.
I love it. I love it. Um, so what happened was I was finishing a day of rides. It was getting to be about 2 p.m., which was the end of lunch hour. So I was heading home and got one last ding on my bike for a delivery. And it said it'd be 6 minutes out of your way. The restaurant that I would needed to pick up from was on my path, and then I'd go 6 minutes to the north and then deliver, and then I'd make it home. So I knew that 6 minutes was the car time, right? And so I figured, okay, well, on a bike, maybe that's 15 minutes, maybe it's 12 minutes. But it was like a $7 order or something. So I was like, okay, I'll do it. And so I get to the restaurant, and it turns out to be two orders. This is just how Uber, they can ask you, hey, do you want to do an additional order? I click yes. Realized that it wasn't 6 minutes. It was about 45 minutes up one of the biggest hills in Pittsburgh. And on the map, they don't tell you you're going up a hill. You can't zoom in on the map. You can't see exactly where it is. It's just a map of Pittsburgh and two dots. And so I couldn't tell that it was up this giant hill, but I couldn't cancel the order once the food was in my hand and I could actually see the address. So I bike up the hill. It's 45 minutes. I run out of water. It's 2 p.m. and super hot. Make the other delivery. And I get home, and when I check my statement, I realized that I was only paid for, I forget the exact numbers, but I think it was like 2 miles, but I know I went 4 miles. And I was like, well, they underpaid me, right? My statement says that I got the $7 for a 2 mile delivery. So I call Uber and I let them know, and they say, "Why don't you try restarting your phone?" So, well, what is that going to do? So I push back and I say, "What's restarting my phone going to do? Like this is an issue. You paid me for 2 miles instead of four." Um, I think I end up spending 126 minutes on the phone and 14 customer service emails where I get all sorts of strange responses like, "Why don't you uninstall and reinstall the app?" And I'm a technologist. I write code. And so after all of that time spent, somebody finally agrees, "Hey, we see the issue. We underpaid you. Here's $4, the correct payment." And so I go to bed that night and I wonder, how many other people is this happening to? How many times is Uber taking money, just $4 at a time from people, and nobody else is going to have the time to spend this many hours on the phone with Uber. So that night, I come up with the idea of this Chrome extension that's going to look at your statements and figure out how much you were underpaid by. It's going to look at the image and say, okay, you actually traveled 4 miles, but you were only paid for 2 miles. And so I had this idea at night. The next day, I woke up early. I wrote the Chrome extension. By midnight the next day, it was released. It was on the Chrome store. Hundreds, maybe a few thousand people downloaded the extension, saw the scale of how much Uber was taking money. It was between like 15 and 20 was underpaying. So huge amounts of money, right? Only a dollar or two at a time, but multiplied by millions of trips a day. It was a real issue. And so I had all this data from all of these people who had Uber take money from them. Matthew, please jump in.
I just wanted to say there that like what I didn't understand, and maybe others who haven't worked for Uber might not realize, is how little data and you have as an Uber rider, right? There's so little transparency around the basics of what one would expect from their job. So if you and I are doing a job, we know what we're being paid, and what the expectation is. So if we're working these many days a week for these many hours, this is what we get paid. So there's a way to sort of calculate and know if there's something wrong. And what made, I think, Armin, your story so powerful is that like there are the millions of drivers around the world who are not told what, there's no equation to work out your wage, and it's so changeable because it's algorithmic. So it's as you said at the start, it has to be as efficient as possible, and it's affected by variables that range from the weather to whether there's a big sports game going on that day. And you can do the same job, the same trip 2 days in a row and get paid differently, and you would have no idea why. And it was that sense of that lack of agency where the AI system essentially is controlling what you get paid to the point where you don't even know what's fair or due to you, that made this kind of more galling. And in Armin's case, the reason he realized he was underpaid is he just sort of guessed he'd gone longer, but they don't even tell you the zip codes of where you're going, and he had to kind of work that out. That was the kind of innovation there.
Yeah, so when you look at your statement, they don't tell you the start and end destination. They claim it's because of privacy, but we know the real reason is not privacy, but because they don't want you doing this. What the extension did is it was actually able to look at an image and look at the metadata of the image. And Uber had, I think, mistakenly left the GPS coordinates hidden in the metadata of that image. And so that's what the extension did, is it looked at the metadata of the image to find the actual start and end coordinates, and that's how I was able to figure out the distance traveled for real, not what they told you. And what Uber will tell you, and I'm sure Matt, who got this response, and other journalists did too, is they'll say, well, every driver consented to the payment, right? We told them you're getting $7 up front, and you got $7, which is true. I did agree to $7, that they never put in the responses is they're not giving you the right information to make that informed decision. So I knew I was getting paid $7. I would have never taken it for the length of trip that I had.
So, Madhu, building on this, I think one of I'm going to ask you two questions. One is, when you heard the story, how did you kind of start thinking about it in the context of, the chapter, which is your boss, which is in itself a very nice way of, articulating what's really going on here, especially in the context of gig work. But then the other part of the story that I wanted to basically, invite you to think a little bit more about is, what was the first story that you actually worked on as a chapter for this book? And how do you see the different stories that you have in the collection as speaking to each other, and how that relates to the way in which Armin kind of goes to basically building a strategy around what can be done in order to do some of these things. So, I'm just broadly interested in thinking with you about one, a comparative way of thinking about what these stories do, and then second, how do we start to think a little bit more about the core ways in which we can respond to the kinds of challenges that Armin has brought up.
Yeah. So the first question and then the latter questions are actually related. And for me as a writer, it's about structure, right? And maybe if you're an academic, that structure will help to form your thinking. For me as a writer, it's about narrative. But actually, with Armin's story, it was. What was unique about it was that it was a fighting back story. Because before that, if you look at the 6 chapters before, a lot of the people in that are people who've been helping to build AI behind the scenes, data laborers in Kenya, for example, people who've been victims of AI software, like the poet who had deep fake pornography made of her here in the UK, Helen. So people who didn't have any agency and couldn't do anything about it. Or people who were working alongside it, like the doctor in rural India, Ashita Singh, who was helping to train it and was sort of comparing herself to these systems. But it was often about sort of either being on the sharp end of it or working alongside it. So with Armin's story, I wanted that to start the section on sort of human response to this. So what can we do to find a voice? So it forms the final third of the book, which is really, so that's how I kind of structured it. And as you said, it's called Your Boss, but every chapter is your something, because I wanted it to speak to the reader, that it could be you just as much as
Right.
it's person. So, your body, your livelihood, your freedom, your health. And that, so the final 3 chapters, which begins with Armin and then looks at Corey Kreider, who's a lawyer and civil rights activist, and then ends with Maya Wang, human rights activist from China, is really about like scaling up to that crescendo of what can we as humans do to have a voice, have agency, and to assert our dignity and rights, within an increasingly sort of automated society. And I wanted it to be the hopeful part of the book, because I didn't, it is a book that brings up a lot of dark stories, but I wanted people to go away thinking, yes, this is happening, but I can find a way to shape this. I can find, I can speak up about it, or even I can recognize it, before I even do anything about it. So yeah, so that's where Armin's story fit in, and I think we actually extracted his chapter into the FT magazine when the book came out, and we had hundreds of comments on the piece. Just people were just so delighted with that. It's that sort of resilience of the human spirit where it's like, yeah, like I'm gonna find a way around this, and I'm gonna kind of show it to the man, in this case the machine, and the corporation. So that's how that fit in. And in terms of the different stories, as I said, my only real motivation was for it to be as international as possible. So I wanted to go find stories from different parts of the world and look at how people and technology intersect with the culture of that place. In
Right.
Salta, it was about Catholicism and the the attendant kind of beliefs that come with being a very Catholic society, and how that intersected with technology on pregnancies and as teenagers, and how that affected the people and impacted how the system was implemented. For example, in India, I looked at the position of the doctor as a sort of god. Doctors are so respected in India. There's kind of different, I think, to what I've experienced in the West. It's considered one of the most respected jobs you can do. People really, sort of worship their physicians. And in that sort of society, what it's like having a machine do the job of a doctor that people see as more than just a diagnostician. they have a relationship with their local doctor, and what that means. So that was how I was looking at it. But I think I did find patterns that connected all of them, and really it ended up being that most of the individuals I chose to focus on happened to come from vulnerable, marginalized, or minority groups. Not like in some cases it's obvious why, but that's actually how what my reporting revealed. These are the people often most harmed by these systems. And when I talked to Armin about his story, we discussed how so many Uber drivers tend to be migrants and so precarious, sort of a month away from falling back into kind of poverty, and can't afford to spend time thinking about how to fix these issues, and so are kind of forced to accept the rules that Uber lays down. And so in all these cases, really the thing that spoke to me most was how AI is widening the gaps, the inequality gaps, and silencing voices that are already marginalized. And sort of, yeah, and hopefully our mean story and that of the people in the chapters after him help us to kind of find a way through that.
Absolutely. So you answered all of it. Just one very quick question. Which one was the first story that you worked on?
It was Carl Rissenek, who is the facial recognition researcher, who also happens to be
Fantastic.
African American. And for me, I was talking about this today. His story really captured the sort of gray area of this technology, because he always thought of himself as a computer scientist, and he really believed in the power of facial recognition and how it's going to save lives and save missing people. But during the course of his lifetime or his career, he saw that it had been completely weaponized and transformed into a surveillance technology that was used against people who looked exactly like him. And he had this like profound moral dilemma that he went through when I met him, about sort of what's my role in all of this.
Right.
And I'm not just a technologist who builds things, but I have a responsibility for how they get used. And which is something that's much newer. And Armin and I have talked about this too. Previously computer scientists, they aren't trained ethicists. They aren't trained to sort of question where the tech ends up and who it affects and what that means. That's sort of somebody else's problem. Increasingly, you can't dissociate in that way, because the way it's designed has such an impact on the effects that it has on people. And so Carl and his story is what sort of sparked this book.
Great. So we already have a bunch of questions. They're all kind of connected to Armin's story. So I'm going to ask them to you, Armin. The first one is, what was Uber's reaction to, UberCheats? Did they make it easier to validate revenue or make it more difficult? That's the first question. And the second question is specifically about your Chrome extension, which is about, did the Chrome extension calculate the distance with the exact route you took to the destination?
I'll answer the second one first because that's a little easier. It didn't have access to the exact route you took. So what it did, it looked at the start and end destination, looked at all possible routes, and gave Uber the benefit of the doubt. So not where did you go, but where was the fastest you could travel, the fewest miles you could travel to get there. What was that number? And so it always gave Uber the benefit of the doubt, even if the fewest miles was actually the longest in time. It still gave Uber the benefit of the doubt. As for the second question, what was Uber's reaction? My understanding, so the extension was up for about a year, and every 3 or 4 months, Uber would change their code on their website, which would break the extension, and then I'd have to go and fix the extension. And so after chasing that for a year or year and a half, I finally gave up on it because it just became so much work to maintain. When I shut it down a year and a half later, I still had people, because I was collecting the data, I still had people who were hitting the same bug. And so Uber's reaction was not to fix it. Publicly, they said that there's no issue and that they pay people fairly. So Uber's reaction, I wouldn't say great, right? It didn't seem like any progress was made. Where this did help was in getting the conversation started with a lot of these unions that are trying to form around gig work. And that's where we saw the increase, right? Because Uber's not going to do anything unless there's enough pressure. And I think the
Right.
press is one direction of the pressure, but I don't think it was enough for them to fix it. I think
Right.
collective action hopefully will be a little more effective in getting Uber to change this or fix this bug.
So, Armin, your story kind of reminds me of this more recent news story published in Bloomberg about how Uber and Lyft have exploited a loophole in New York City's driver pay formula by implementing frequent lockouts that prevent drivers from logging into the apps, which in turn lowers their on-the-clock time and reduces minimum pay obligations that these companies have to drivers. This manipulation of driver utilization rates has forced drivers to, work for longer periods of time, jeopardize their financial stability, and even spark protests and scrutiny by both city officials and federal agencies. All of this to say that your work on UberCheats is one of the many interventions that is needed in order to bring some of the deeper understanding among people, specifically, and more, more specifically, gig workers around what is going on with these systems. And I'm wondering about how, you know, you kind of take that experience, and it's also one of the questions that has been asked here. How do you take your experience of working on UberCheats to think about some of these, emergent issues that are coming up in this space, and how, over time, your perspective on what this work needs has changed? And we can start with that as a way to kind of reflect on what's really going on here, and then Madhu, I can bring you in terms of thinking more deeply about, some of the strategies that you have found to be useful in this space. I mean.
Yeah, I think it's difficult. So this recent thing in New York City where there's minimum pay obligations if you work a certain amount, and so Uber's putting these lockouts. Publicly, what they say could make sense, right? Is that they have to do this in order to make any money. It's not unreasonable to believe that that is true. The issue is that there's no transparency, right? And so with an Uber driver, I mean, gig work and rideshare is really seen as part of a city's transportation network at this point, but it doesn't have the transparency that, say, our bus or rail networks have.
Right.
And so if our bus network says, hey, we have to increase fares because we're not making enough money, the public can take a look. They can analyze it. They can, all of the finances are public, and we can validate that. Uber here can say whatever they want. And there's no transparency. And so they can claim that they have to do this. But the reason might not be to make money. It might be to get everybody to protest, to push against this law and get it repealed. And if that's Uber's goal and not, hey, we need to do this to make money, we as a public can't differentiate the two. And so it's one of the issues that happens when we kind of privatize these public services, which last mile transit really is a public service at this point. Is there's no democracy around it. There's no transparency. There's no input we have, and so we're kind of we're at the hands of these big corporations. And so, what is the solution? I don't know. Is it regulation, mandating transparency? Is it I don't know. I don't know what the solution is. But at the end of the day, when I see them put out these press releases, I believe that it's reasonable. But I can't believe it because I know their incentives are to not tell the truth and not be forthcoming about why they have to do these lockouts and these dark patterns.
Fair enough. Madhumita.
I just wanted to say the question that was asked, just because I'm curious about the answer as well, is how also Armin has adapted what he's learned, Armin, from like sort of trying to figure out the Uber algorithms and UberCheats and how you apply that to your work now. And I'm curious if there are lessons learned because you're a technology builder again.
Yeah, so my current work, I'm the founder of a company called Dashcam Bike, and what we do is collect data for bicycling safety.
Right.
And one of the gaps in the data that the city has is there's no data on bike safety really. For crash data for drivers, there's quite a lot of data. For bikes and pedestrians, most cities in the US don't really have data on where issues are happening. And so one of the lessons I've taken from my work with UberCheats into Dashcam is that all data that we collect from our users is publicly accessible, is in city government databases, but also on our front-facing website so that anybody can go and look. And when we analyze something, if we say, hey, this bike lane, you added, say, concrete protection or flex posts, you protected this bike lane in some way, And that was this percent effective, right? This
I
reduced
see.
cars parking in the bike lane by 80%. All that data is accessible to the public in a very easy to read format. So researchers at the local university can take our data and verify everything we're saying. And that transparency is very important for me because I see how companies um, can make a profit by not being this transparent, right? I can see how places like Uber and how we could even make more money if we held this data close to our chest and forced the public through the city to pay for that data. Um, but it leads to all these issues, and I don't. I think it leads to companies with the wrong incentive, right? You want to set up your incentive structure from the very start of the company such that it is beneficial to you as a company to serve the public as opposed to just to make money. And so that's the lesson I've took is not that Uber's like, I don't know. I don't think anybody at Uber is evil, right? I think their incentive structures are such that this is the way they work. And I didn't want any of those incentive structures to frame the way that I lead my own company.
And it's exactly true for how AI is implemented in so many other ways. When I mentioned the Argentina example, where AI systems were developed by the local government with Microsoft, and when when a private company works with the public sector to come up with an AI system, you would expect that it's transparent, that people understand where their data is going, that they have a way to appeal the decisions that come out of it, because ultimately it is a public service, right? Whether it's, here in the UK, we use it for things like benefits fraud to check if people are actually who are claiming benefits are really who they say they are. But it's all of that sort of knowledge data is locked up within these private companies who say, oh, well, we don't really even know how AI systems work. Therefore, it's a black box and therefore we can't explain it to anybody else. And that's just not good enough when we're looking for accountability. I think it's key that, we don't have to understand all the weights in a machine learning algorithm, but we can expect to know why a decision was made and how to appeal it if you don't agree or if you see that it's going wrong. And I think that's something that's really failing in AI implementation today.
So, Madhu, based on that, I think there are two questions in our, in open Q&A, which kind of speak to this particular issue of how do we start thinking about some of these issues, right? So one of them is basically, thinking about how AI is being used in HR hiring and performance management practices and how that to a certain extent shapes how we understand the opacity of these systems and what needs to be transparent about them. And the second one is kind of related to facial recognition technology, but it's kind of focused on this question of responsibility. Who is responsible when for the questions that facial recognition technology actually raises? Is it the product designer? Is it the product manager? One part of this question is how do we start thinking about responsibility? And the other part of this question is, how do we actually then start to think about domain-specific issues that inevitably come to, intersect with the way in which this technology is designed? Because fundamentally, this technology is about pattern recognition in one way or the other. And, what we're trying to do is to figure out whether these patterns make sense. And some of them are dark patterns, as Armin put for in the case of, how these technologies are kind of interfacing with the way in which gig work is evaluated and valued. So,
Yeah, on the question on performance management and hiring, actually, in the same chapter where I tell Armin's story, I look a little bit more broadly at AI systems and specifically, I spoke to a therapist, a counselor in, I think it was Rhode Island, who was working for a big US healthcare insurer. And essentially, she had been forced to implement this type of an AI system to manage the other therapists, trained counselors, psychologists that she worked with. And I thought it was really interesting because I was asking her about the sort of behavioral impact. How did the people who were now subject to this performance management, how did they respond to it? And she said, it had a hugely detrimental effect on their performance because firstly, it starts with the design, right? So this AI system was essentially measuring how long people were sat at their desk. and how long they were logged into their platform. Whereas the job of, the therapist, counselors, psychologists was to go out into the community to visit people in their homes and their hospitals, which obviously, is involves hours away from your desk. It's not a desk job. Yet, the metrics on which they were being measured was sort of how long are you logged into the system writing reports. So it meant people were rushing back, and rather than spending time with other humans and doing their actual job, were coming back. And then the other issue was just the not knowing, and it's so similar to with Uber, right? But in a very different scenario, kind of a
Right.
white collar job, where they didn't know how do I maximize my performance points in order to get this bonus. Like, what am I trying to improve?
Right.
It's not clear to me, like the AI system, like it wasn't clear to them exactly what patterns it was looking for. So, for these people, it was kind of like, give me a chance to be better at whatever I need to be better at, but it's not clear to me what I'm meant to be doing. And so it actually caused a lot of psychological disruption where people were starting to doubt themselves. They were, burned out, stressed out, and just this feeling of not being in control of your own destiny and your own work. So it ended up being at cross purposes to sort of, monitoring performance in this way. So I think my real concern with these types of HR systems is it's not necessarily that they exist. I can see why an HR AI hiring, recruitment tool, maybe you can design it in a way to sort of fight against human bias. But I think often it's designed without thought to how it's going to affect people doing the job, or thinking clearly about actually what are we trying to maximize? What do we want to get out of this? Not just imposing a technology into a scenario which like a one size fits all. And in the case of recruitment, often using biased data from historical hiring that ends up essentially multiplying the discrimination that was happening before, but scaling it up because you're just doing this in an automated way. But that doesn't mean there aren't smart ways of doing it if people are thoughtful about, that, because there is a lot of evidence about how much human bias comes into the hiring process, and how much your own sort of self-selection means that you like or don't like somebody that you see in an interview. And so if there is a way to make that more objective, more fair, I'd be curious to see what that would look like. But the issue for me so far is the sort of poor design, and this sort of reliance on the fact that that technology can solve any problem without actually looking, at what are the problems in my specific sector that need to be solved. So in the case of, Argentina, they did this, the story I tell is of an AI system that's predicting teenage pregnancies. And what I learned from that was, what the solutions that the community requires are really nothing to do with targeted AI systems. They need more social workers, they need youth centers, they need the potholes fixed so that people feel safe being outside, and you don't need AI to tell you that. So it's often just really considering, like, do I need AI for this problem or not? Yeah, I think, yeah. And the other question on facial recognition, I think the
Yeah.
responsibility is regulatory. It's companies that build the technologies there needs to be regulation on, is it a biased system? Are the errors in one direction? Is it, do you have higher error rates on darker skinned and female faces, which has been the case for years? And if yes, then how can you possibly have a commercial version of the system roll out? So I think, we need to regulate both the people building the product as well as the people implementing it, which in many cases is law enforcement, which tends to often be above, the law. And therefore they kind of wield it. But there's no point using a tool that's, systematically, I call it racist or biased, but like at its core, it's, error prone. What's the point? And so I think, yeah, the responsibility starts, with regulators, but it has to trickle down to the people building the technology and those who implement it.
This is great. Also because it kind of points to this larger set of issues that Armin brought up, which was kind of centered on how do we design incentive structures that allow us to actually think about these technologies differently, and what does it mean to actually create systems that are transparent and then allow for a very different kind of relationship between people who use them and people who develop them, and that to a certain extent allows us to think about this question of responsibility differently as well.
Yeah,
So
but just to say on regulation, there's a lot of lobbying from tech companies now, big tech in particular, to say we shouldn't be regulating at the model stage. We should be
right.
regulating at the application layer because,
Yeah.
ultimately we're just building general purpose models that can be used in many different ways. And so when they're used to harm people, whatever, that's on the people who've rolled it out and who've built applications. But I don't agree with that. I think there has to be some level of responsibility on the people who build the actual technology to say, actually, there is a way to audit this technology. Here's how we can evaluate it. Here's how we know it's not harmful. Here's what we've done to test it. Otherwise, it's just Wild West of people putting out whatever they want and then saying, well, it's up to the recruitment company or the hospital to figure it out, which I think is not fair because, there's a lack of understanding there. You need both parties to accept accountability for the things that they build.
Absolutely. And it kind of points to, you already started this, but, it kind of points to the next set of questions that I had in mind, which are kind of oriented towards thinking a little bit more deeply about what the future that we are moving into and how we should start thinking about an AI infused future at the very minimum rather than an AI driven future, which are two very different ways of conceptualizing what our relationship with this technology is. So what I'm going to do is to first invite Armin into your reflections on how you're thinking about from based on your experiences of actually building this tech, designing accessible data sets in order for uh, you know thinking more deeply about bike safety in general. Can we take some of the ways and the principles and incentives that you've kind of thought about in terms of your own company to then tell us about a little bit more about how you conceptualize what this future, which kind of will be inflected by AI and generative AI particularly. Uh, what would it look like, and how do you imagine we orient towards it, and how are the different ways in which we can build resistance and organization around the ways in which the challenges that are going to emerge should be addressed?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult question. There's a few different ways that AI will affect. One is the things that are in sci-fi movies, right? And the things that are a little newer, like general AI and ChatGPT are all new. But there's another set of issues uh, that we've been dealing with for a very long time. So Madhu
Right.
had in her book the deep fakes, but there's been a version of that available for a long time, which is just Adobe Photoshop, right? It's become easier, but the problems are the same. And one of the hard things is that we haven't done a good job at dealing with the problems when we saw them, right? Like
Right.
the problem of deepfakes was an issue 20 years ago with access to Photoshop. We didn't deal with it then, and now that it's so much easier, our hands are not tied, but it's like we should have had solutions already. And so in the future, I think that's what we need to look towards is um, s- trying to figure out the real problems that people are going to have, not the sci-fi scary ones, but the ways they affect real people at the small scales because they'll only accelerate, and we don't know the ways in which they'll accelerate, but we'll need to solve it. Another example in Madhu's book is the labelers. We've had Amazon Mechanical Turk doing labeling way before AI exploded in this way. And I remember 2009 or 2011, I think, was the first conversation I had about, hey, is it fair that we're paying people in internet cafes like 1 cent per task to do this thing that would cost on here like 50 cents per task? Is
Right.
that a fair system? Are we taking advantage of these people? And people were asking the questions, but there were no answers or solutions. And now it's scaled up. So I also don't have any answers, but I think one of the things we need to do is take problems seriously when they're at a small scale. Because once they accelerate to the pace that AI has brought them, it's become so much harder. It becomes so much harder to figure out the solutions. And I think we need to front load it. We need to do it sooner. We need to see the small problems and start addressing them. So I
Right.
know that was a bit of a non-answer saying I don't
No, no,
know.
no. I think it's the argument that we need to basically start paying attention to our experience with these technologies. I think is really crucial, and I think that's one of the core tenets of codependent as a work in terms of thinking more deeply about we can talk about a lot of problems conceptually, but when we bring it down to somebody's experience, we see certain parts of this particular story where fairness, transparency, all of these ideas mean something very specific rather than being an abstract idea that we need to basically work towards. And I think that distinction is an important one to draw. And thank you for drawing it in the first place. And so I'm going to take it to Madhu now. And, same question, but at the same time, we can also inflect it with one of the questions that we have from the audience, which is about, you know, uh, they're really enjoying your book, first of all, James, and they're a fellow writer. And how do you think about the Gen AI boom and how it's affected the creative process of making art and writing? So, what is the future around these technologies? How do we start to orient ourselves towards it? And then, we can take the case of creative industry as a way to kind of think about some of these issues.
Yeah, I think even when I was writing this book in, 2022, 2023, it was clear how quickly it was being infused into so many aspects, right? And in this book, one thing is that it's global, and I go to look at stories in these different countries, but without really designing it, it's also about lots of different areas and verticals. So I look at work, I look at healthcare, criminal justice, government services, identity and deep fakes, and so all of these, and now increasingly with generative AI, it's entered everything from, education. It's already been a part of financial services, and as James says, creative processes as well, and jobs like mine. And so I think where we are now, there's so much money riding on it, and this kind of connects to the other part of my job, which is as a journalist at the FT, where I kind of follow the money to look at how, as Armin said, how does the profit motive incentivize companies to behave in a certain way, and then how is that reflected in the power structure that emerge from this technology. And it comes down to the money, the investment, right? These companies are pouring billions and billions of dollars into trying to build these new AI systems, and they have to find a way for that to pay off. And that's fine. That's part of that's capitalism, right? But we're seeing, I think last year the capital expenditure of Microsoft was something like $56 billion, and like most of that was on AI infrastructure, like data centers and all of the stuff around it. And you can see the value of Nvidia, which makes the chips that AI runs on. It's like more than a $3 trillion company today, the second most valuable company in the world. And so there's a lot of money riding on it. For these companies, they have to show that there are applications, that there are commercially useful products. They have to, they're not just signing deals with other companies. They're signing deals with healthcare systems, hospitals, schools and universities, government departments. So just recently, with the Pentagon, with the DoD, military departments of governments, this is widespread now. And because so much money is riding on it, there's a lot more incentive to push this into our world. And so I do see a world where, it's now almost like sort of unfashionable to question, like, why do I need to use AI? Even here at our work, or anyone that I talk to, it's sort of a given where it's like, you have to use AI, and the question is like how to do it, or how do we take advantage of it, or how do we make the most of it, rather than anybody actually starting with the premise of like, but do I need AI at all? And so that, in that kind of world, as you said, Ranjit, it's about paying attention to our own experiences, because that's how we can have I think, an opinion, feel informed, and then have a voice. So here at the FT, speaking of the creative process, this is obviously, we are writers, we have designers and date, graphic designers and so on, people who do graphical design, illustrators, and this is the our core job is creative, and a lot of we question all the time, why would I use AI to do what I do? Because A, it's what I love, and B, we still believe we can do it better. That's what we bring. That's the promise we bring to our readers. And as an author, it's the connection you build between your reader, and through telling these stories, me telling you which stories mattered to me, and using my words to explain, why they should matter to you. That's sort of a conversation between us. So I think for me, I can't imagine a world where you don't have like humans involved in that. And so pushed back for a long time on sort of AI having any role at all in creative processes.
I see.
But I am trying to open up and be more open to it as possibly in like a new tool. Like Armin said, there's been Photoshop that's been used by illustrators and graphic designers. There have been other technologies that people have embraced, which have maybe augmented the creative work that they do. And so I don't use it for my day-to-day work, but I'm curious now and more open to examples of other creatives who have used it. I read a great essay by Vohini Vara, which others might have read. I think it was called The Ghost. I forget the exact name. It had ghost in it, but it was about the real experience of her losing her sister. And it was an experience that was so profoundly painful for her that she'd never been able to write about it herself. But she did a sort of co-write with ChatGPT, where she provided the prompts, it wrote stuff, and then she built on that back and forth. And the end product was something just really amazing, which she says that, she wouldn't have done on her own. So yeah, so I think maybe on one hand be open to how this could change the work that we do, and I'm curious to see how that is the case. But I also feel that the human like sort of role in all this, particularly in art and creativity, but also when it comes to medicine. I mean, I was just the other day talking to a bunch of wealth managers and private bankers, totally different world. But for them, human connection, they say, is at the heart of what they do, because it's like advising people on changing life circumstances, and that connection they think is the most important part of their job, and a robot advisor could never do it. So there's, this human relationships at the heart of everything that we do in work and in life. And so, yeah, I want that to continue to be the core rather than just replacing. That's what I would hope.
That's beautiful. And thank you for bringing it down, because, to some extent, there's also this larger set of conversations that are happening around, how can, bots kind of help with human connection in one way or the other. And it kind of opens up a wide variety of different conversations around how we think about what is it to be a human in this space and to think about some of these issues. We are right at the end of our hour. We have one really wonderful question that is remaining, so I'm going to ask it. I'm sure you're not going to be able to answer it, but let's try and figure out how we can answer it briefly. So the question is, how do you think about the non-profit philanthropic sector can best serve ethical and human-centered tech, and what might be some of the obstacles of doing so? And a brief response to just thinking about how can the non-profit sector actually contribute to this particular conversation and think with it in a way. I'll begin with Armin. Last words.
It's broad. I'll try to give a concrete
Yeah.
example. One of the organizations I work with is called the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center. And what they do is they bridge the gap in tech on ranked choice voting, which is an electoral reform, by creating software that can bridge the hardware from different companies, because none of these companies are going to build the software on their own, because what they want in this software is, if you want the software, you need the whole state to use their hardware. And so they want everybody to switch to their hardware. So what this nonprofit does is they now bridge the gap. So no matter what hardware the state has, they can use the same software, which no for-profit company is going to do, because they make their money on the hardware. They don't want the software to interoperate. So I don't know exactly how that plays out, but that's a concrete example of what the nonprofit sector can do that the for-profit sector would never do.
Beautiful.
I think on that
Wonderful.
same theme, it's about thinking about what problems we want to solve that aren't going to be financially lucrative, and therefore the corporations who currently own AI, there's only a handful of them today that own, the actual technology. It's almost impossible to it's basically impossible to build a large language model if you don't have billions of dollars and a massive cloud infrastructure and all of the data on the internet. Even for governments to do it is
Right.
basically, so we're all dependent, right? So I think the role of nonprofits here can be, what are some other problems we would like to solve where AI might have
Mm,
a role, but might not necessarily be highly profitable, high margin business like healthcare, right? Which everybody wants to solve because, you've got all that pharma money there. Maybe it's, looking at local communities, definitely working with like local governments. I spoke to a really amazing group of people who work for Luminate, which is Pierre Omidyar's nonprofit, foundation, and they do a lot to surface stories of people, humans all around the world who are working, like Armin, to kind of fight their way through just automation. So whether that's press freedom or agency, in the face of automation, or helping unionization of gig workers, I think these are all, as Armin says, at its core, it's what are the things that for-profit companies aren't going to do, and
absolutely.
therefore, and I can see a question here from Natalie, but she says, yeah, it's right now AI is kind of dominated by tech bros, and I think that's where nonprofits come in. How do you bring in new voices into this debate, and whether that's minorities or people from other parts of the world, other genders, to reflect that this technology is not just know, for and by the people in California and imposed on the rest of us, but something that we can all, have a stake in.
That's fantastic. And that's a fantastic way to conclude this conversation. Thank you so much, Armin and Madhumita, for joining us. Please have a look at this book. It was an absolutely fabulous read. I enjoyed reading it deeply, and I recommend it to anybody and everybody who's interested in basically just thinking more deeply about what does it mean to live with these technologies and how do we actually, one, make sense of them and then begin to kind of reclaim our agency in the face of these systems. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Everyone.